I welcome you guys again to the Fort Kent Historical Society, and are you all set back? Oh, no, it's okay. Welcome you again. I believe we've owned this building now. Rita will probably remember, at least it's our 6th year we own this building, and this year we've finally been able to. We're going to be turning it into that dream museum we've always wanted, and especially this year it's our 150th anniversary. So, okay, where should we start the history of Fort Kent? Where would you start?
In Fort Kent.
Yeah, that helps, and that's a good point I'd like to make to everybody, is Fort Kent has not changed a square inch since February 23rd, 1869. We're the exact same size from that date forward. So for 150 years, Fort Kent's been Fort Kent. 2 townships, actually, which is a little unusual, and we'll talk about it a little later, but it was 2 townships put together. And it was Joshua Chamberlain, who some historians would debate, but some historians would say he won the Civil War for us. He was governor of Maine, and he was the one on that morning that signed the proclamation to make Fort Kent a town. So February 23rd, 1869. So we'll start there, at the end, because I want to start now at the beginning. So we could never, ever speak of Fort Kent without talking about the Acadians. And I'll just brush up a little bit on them, but a lot of the families, they were the first families that moved to North America in 1604. Some of my ancestors, the Terrios, they came over between 1604 and 1608, and they stayed with Champlain. They were part of the Bon Vieux Temps movement in Acadia at the time, and predominantly the Acadians remained in Acadia until 1755, as you folks already know. So in 1755, the British decided to deport our ancestors. However, our ancestors that live here were the ones that saw the writing on the wall and said, we need to go. We need to go. Because it was almost, and to put it in perspective, this was almost like a Jewish pogrom. It was almost like a genocide. It was almost like the Holocaust. That was the point of the whole thing, is to get rid of them. And that's why they dropped them off all over the eastern seaboard, to try to make sure that they blended with the Americans. Or the British. They were British at the time. So consequently, there's only one family here in the valley that was actually deported. Does anybody know who it was? Or we're just doing momentarily research on this, but we find that the Robichaud family had initially been deported to Maryland and walked back to the province of Quebec. So then from the province of Quebec, a couple generations, they moved here to the valley. So the Robichauds are the only family that we can trace had Acadian roots. They were deported. They went to Maryland, walked back. So 2 generations later, 2 brothers, Salomon and, je pense l'autre c'était Nori, moved to Violet Settlement. So we have Robichauds in the valley because of those 2 gentlemen. And those 2 gentlemen, actually, when they died, they were the oldest men in Fort Kent when they died. So they had longevity. They died in the 1950s. So they were in their late 90s. So that's very unusual that somebody lived that long, but they're the strictly only family. So for the rest of our families that weren't deported, we were the victors. We definitely knew what was going on. They were afraid, apparently, and they moved. So we have one certain Acadian that, through exhaustive research, we've been able to find out where he went in that 30-year period. So it was just like the Jews in the desert, a 30-year exodus. They went from Prince Edward Island, they went to Newfoundland, they went to Quebec, they came back to Fredericton, they went back to Quebec. So we have details of a grandson that is born, for example. He was the godfather, so, he was in Saint-Basile by this time. So we've researched, his name was Joseph Simon Daigle. And he's the fellow, he arrived here in 1785 in St. David, and he's the fellow that negotiated with the local Maliseets and got a homeland for the Acadians. Their Israel was finally here. They did believe when they did settle, though, that they were settling on British property. They understood they did not like the British, but they understood they also had to work with them in order for the economy to continue and for them to get their promised land. So finally, 1785, the American Revolution is over. The British government is offering territory in Saint-Ouen-des-Pays-Bas, Fredericton, where the Acadians had lived for about 10, 15 years, but they did not have title to any of their properties. So finally, in 1785, Joseph Simon d'Aigle petitioned the British government to be given the lands above the Grand Falls. So that's what he did. Him and all his families, he was quite an elderly gentleman at the time when he moved here, but they moved and settled in 1785. So those people stayed there until approximately 1810, and that's when we noticed that there are first settlers settling in what we know as Fort Kent today. So again, when talking about settlement, you have to talk about, of course, geography. And that's the point I tried to make to you a while ago, that first and foremost, we're the same size. So in this area, the first known settlement was 1810. Three brothers, Hilarion, Dominique, and Firmin d'Aigle. They settled on a little island on the Frenchville Road called D'Aigle Island. There was a census taken in 1831 by the government, the Maine government. They sent two gentlemen up here to survey and find out how long these people had been living there, what improvements they made, etc., etc. So in that census, the three brothers said that they had moved there in 1810 and had settled. They were all squatters, of course. They had no title to any of their property. But, and then in 1831, Dominique was building a house on the shore. So that house, believe it or not, we believe is Elmer or Vallier-Thibault House on the Frenchville Road, possibly our oldest building in Fort Kent, still standing. We always assumed it was the blockhouse, and we always say it's the Doobie House because we want to pump it up, you know, but it's not. It possibly, that building, the kitchen part, is an original building from 1831.
That's it.
I believe, yeah, one of the older ones. Now, ironically, getting back to D'Aigle Island, when the Webster-Ashburton Treaty was settled in 1842, they decided in Washington, they never came here, they decided that way down there, they partied all summer, and decided that the deepest part of the St. John River was going to be the border. So when they did the survey in 1844, D'Aigle Island, the first place that was settled in Fort Kent, became Canadian. But initially, like I said, they also claimed the mainland, so that area where the D'Aigle House is and the rest area and all those places, that's the first spot that Fort Kent was settled, definitely. They also had a brother that came. His brother's name was Jean-Baptiste d'Aigle. Jean-Baptiste d'Aigle came in a couple of years after his brothers. And by the time of the treaty, he perhaps was the richest Acadian in the valley. So we're not talking children of the first patriarch, but grandchildren. So fast forward 25 years to 1810, the grandchildren are moving upriver slowly. And in that section of woods, it was considered part of St. Louis, or part of Frenchville at that time. So Jean-Baptiste d'Aigle, eventually he ended up with the largest treaty lot ever, 433 acres. And we know it now as Market Street, Fort Kent. Because the complete, where the church is, everything else was not there after the Doobie House. So the Doobie House was on the bank of the river behind JFK College, but it was the only structure on that the whole plateau. And they were the buckwheat growers of our day. They were the Bouchards of our day. So they sold buckwheat to their community, and all of these were buckwheat fields that belonged to them. So the oldest son, who's also Jean-Baptiste, he's the one who built or got the Doobie House when he got married, and he got 100 acres of his father's original lot. So he settled on that, but the father still stayed on the homestead on the Frenchville Road, which is the former Elouet Daigle House. Not the same configuration, but it was a much smaller house on the riverbank, and they moved it to where it is now. And I'm not supposed to tell anybody, but there's talk of purchasing the Eluadego house and turning it into an Acadian homestead in context. You can visit the barn, you can visit the fields, that's what, on rêve en couleur, but we're hoping that's done. So getting back, so 1785, the Acadians moved to St. David. They start slowly moving up the river. By 1810, the Acadians settled in Fort Kent. 1817, the American settlers move here. The American settlers were a gang from the Kennebec area, North Anson, trying to think, Moscow, Maine. Solon, Madison, all of these people came from, so we're talking the Bakers, the Wheelocks, the Honeywells, the Savage, Haffords, they all came together. And they settled this area, settled mostly on the western side of the Fish River today. There was only one Acadian actually on that side, and that was Serfois Nadeau, who he's the one in 1829, he received the property where our blockhouse is now. And in 1839, when the Maine militia came, they kicked him out. And they took over by eminent domain enough place for them to build the blockhouse. Also, because the main point of the blockhouse was almost like a customs house, they were really worried about all the stumpage that was going down the Fish River, down the St. John, into British markets, not American markets. They were really worried about that. So they put up booms, and apparently they seized 10 acres of land on lot 32. So for their boom, and they wanted a garden, a vegetable garden. Jean-Baptiste Daigle, the owner of the property and the builder of our doobie house, went down there and freaked. They arrested him and they put him in the blockhouse, so he was perhaps the only prisoner that was held in the blockhouse. And that's why we believe our own doobie house was built. Because we have maps of when the surveyors came through in 1842, and on this property are 3 buildings. We believe the doobie house possibly was built as a storage barn, and then by 1844, when the oldest son got married, they switched it into a house, and they finished it. Finished it in, I would dare say until 1900, or even the 1880s, it was perhaps the largest house in Fort Kent. It was huge in comparison. It's a large house now, because it's about 2,500 square feet. So for a house like that, you know, where my ancestors, I know my great-grandparents lived in a room, the dirt floor, and they had one room upstairs and one room downstairs. Not much privacy either. So yeah, it was a lot different. So they were the wealthy of our community. So the American settlers come, and they settle, and they start cutting wood, and they start causing trouble. 1827. July 4th, 1827, John Baker in Baker Brook decides he's going to have a 4th of July party and invite all the American and Acadian settlers. He went down to Edmundston, to Little Falls it was at the time, and it must have been the store of John Emerson, who was an Irish fellow, though, that had come over during the 1839 famine, but had a huge store in Edmundston. And those folks really supplied all our ancestors. They supplied mostly the Protestant community, and the Catholic community was served by 2 brothers. They were Dufours out of St. Basil. So all of our ancestors probably shopped at both of them. So he went down to John Emerson's store and he purchased red, white, and blue bunting. And he created a flag. Not a US flag. He probably didn't know what the US flag looked like. So he made a really nice white flag with red stars, and there's an eagle, I think, on it. And now it's used as the flag of the Republic of Madawaska. So he went down there, and of course, people talked. Some of the Acadian settlers who always thought that they were British talked. And Francis Rice, who was the British magistrate, or the sheriff for the whole area, went to go see Mr. Baker and saw the party going on. And Mr. Baker, ironically, had received 2 years before a title to his property, because there was a young man by the name of George Coffin, who was a land agent, came up into the valley in 1825 to see what was going on here. He noticed, however, in 1825 that they were building a mill at the Fish River. So the Tardif Mill, believe it or not, is one of our oldest businesses. 1825, a mill was being built there. They had a grist mill, they had a clapboard mill, they made shingles, they did it all. They had the mouillassi, they had everything there. So consequently, okay, they're building the mill. Where am I? George Coffin gave John Baker a deed to his property in Baker Brook, New Brunswick, now. So he had a deed. So Francis Rice, saying that it was the United States and, William IV is still on the throne and, treason. They arrested him immediately, brought him to Fredericton. He was tried, fined, and imprisoned, I believe, for 3 or 4 months, and released. Quieted down up here. However, by 1830, the state of Maine sent census takers up here, which was very unusual. They did in 1820, but not a complete census, but they sent a census enumerator up here. 1831, the Maine legislature, now, a lot of our problems with this Aroostook War never really came from our ancestors. It was simply like most of our problems today, politics. Yeah, you rolled your eyes, I like that. So everything was political. So the state of Maine was real upset that nothing was going on, that they weren't. So the legislature of 1831 decided that they were going to incorporate the whole Madawaska territory into the town of Madawaska. That's what they called it. So in 1831, we had gone from early 1820s, they called our area Fish River. We have letters that were mailed to the Hafford family in the 1820s, and they were addressed John Harford, Fish River, Maine. So now, in 1831, Fort Kent becomes Madawaska. Don't tell Madawaska people that, okay? We still have a friendly rivalry. I like that. So 1831, they formed the town of Madawaska. They send this guy up here with the proclamation. So a few gentlemen, John Baker included, again, they got together. One of the guys was Daniel Savage, trying to think of a few of the others. Jesse Wheelock, what? They had a town meeting in Frenchville at Pierre Lisotte's house. Pierre Lisotte was a very high, prominent Acadian. They had the meeting and they elected Pierre Lisotte to the legislature. However, he refused. He said, we're on British territory. So again, Francis Rice came out of the woods and arrested those 3 guys for instigating to form the town of Madawaska. So in Frenchville, these 3 guys get arrested. They're going downriver to Edmundston. They get to Little Falls, which still had their blockhouse, and that was their temporary jail. Well, all those men escaped, went back into the woods. Andrew Jackson, the State of the Union address of 1832, which of course was reflective of the year 1831. He wrote in his State of the Union address, the misguided people of Madawaska had started international trouble. And he reassured the Congress of that year that we're going to take care of them. They're going to stop. That was, they thought. So Andrew Jackson, a few years later, 1837, one of the only presidents to balance the budget and actually had a surplus. I believe the last one to do that was Lyndon Johnson. He had a balanced budget. The last balanced budget was in 67, I think, if I remember correctly. But it was Lyndon Johnson. So he decided, Andrew Jackson had this huge surplus. He hated the Bank of America, didn't want to put the money there. So he decided, I'm going to give it back to my countrymen. So he sent guys, census enumerators also, that would record, I gave Pat Dow $5. Things like that. His name was Isaac Greeley. Came up to the valley, started giving away money. Well, they thought, again, they're bribing the Acadians. I mean, most of the time they'd use alcohol, but cash, these people were they thought they were influencing them to, so Mr. Greeley got arrested too. So again, with politics and the red tape and all that, 1839, the spring, March of 1839, the Maine legislature did something unheard of. They declared war on the province of New Brunswick. Never happened again, never happened before, but they declared war. And they mustered troops. The state of Maine had a militia, that it was called, similar to our National Guard of today. So the militia immediately started building the Aroostook Road we know today. So they cut through from Bangor up, right through the woods, and came up here. And the first group that came here, the commander or the captain, his name was Stover Rhines. Ironically, also our first postmaster. He didn't, it wasn't an official position, but he was the postmaster during those Aroostook War scrapes. And then finally, in 1841, the U.S. Army came. So we had a complete different bunch of troops here. So we had the Maine militia, who were all from Maine, all dealing with the 1831 rumbling of war. So they arrived here in September. Stover Rhines and his entourage, they were 40 of them, I believe, because they're mentioned in the census of 1840. So there were 40 of them here. They built the blockhouse as we know it today. Initially, the blockhouse actually is an old design. They wouldn't have built blockhouses like that. Normally, blockhouses were stone and brick by that time. Fort Knox is a great example. Fort Knox was built because of the Aroostook War. So Fort Knox was this huge granite. So they kind of, that's why the fortifications weren't huge here. They kind of knew that this was going to be settled amongst London and Washington, not between Daniel Savage and Pierre Lisette. It wasn't going to be here. It was going to be international. So that's what they wanted to ensure. So 1839, they come, they exert their authority, do all the block everything, make sure all the stumpage is not going down the river into British markets. And then I'm not sure what his position would be, probably Joint Chiefs of Staff of Martin Van Buren. His name was Winfield Scott, and he became later quite a famous Civil War general, but he came to Augusta, met with John Fairfield, who was the governor at that time, because it was Edward Kent, John Fairfield. So he met with him, and he met with John Harvey, the Premier of New Brunswick, and they came up with a truce. They said, well, we're going to let Washington and London figure this out. It has nothing to do with us. So, and that's what they decided to do. So 1839, the blockhouse is abandoned, or 1840, shortly after the census was taken, they left. So we were troopless. In September of 1841, almost a full year before the treaty, they sent U.S. Army troops. And those U.S. Army troops had been stationed in the closest U.S. Army base we had was Fort Hancock in Holton. So they came up here, and the first officer, the captain of the blockhouse, his name was Lucian Bonaparte Webster. He was from Florida, believe it or not. And he brought with him his family. He had 2 young girls. His wife came from a super wealthy military family. Their last name was Kirby. I'm not sure if it's the vacuum family, I doubt it, but they were Kirbys, and they were quite famous in the military. Like, they were West Point graduates, as Captain Webster was. And they also brought something that Fort Kent hadn't seen before and hasn't seen since. They also brought slavery to Fort Kent. Because both Lucian Webster and Mrs. Webster had personal servants. Or personal slaves, rather. They weren't servants, they weren't paid. They were paid, however, and that's how we know they had them. They were reimbursed by the U.S. government for their slave. So as an officer, they got $3 or $4 a month to pay the board, room and board of their own valet or manservant. So they stayed around here, and they're the ones who built all the outbuildings. So they built a huge barracks for the enlisted men, they built officers' quarters, they built a hospital, they built a commissary, they built stables, they had a magazine for the ammunition, they had guard shacks everywhere. It was quite an extensive operation that happened here. The local people must have been shocked. It was like literally they were building a city in the middle of nowhere. So that's what they did. They built those buildings and they had proper facilities. Unfortunately, with Lucian Webster, one of his daughters died here. She was 2 years old. I believe her name was Sophia. And there was no cemetery in Fort Kent at the time, so they brought her to Holton to be buried, and that's where she still is. So Lucian Webster left Fort Kent in 1843. They were sorry to see him go. And most sorry, however, were the British soldiers from Little Falls, because they would get together often and do what men do. They drank a lot. So, they even had, the sutler had cases of alcohol for them. So they shared and got to know each other, and it was truly a peaceful war, something that we should celebrate, because all wars now are, you know, shoot first and ask later. You know, so, and that wasn't that at all. That was a really friendly, peaceful resolution to everything. So 1843, they take off. The blockhouse is abandoned again. Some strange reason, because of the treaty and because, you know, their troops had been there, the government decided to send a second wave of troops. So in 1843, they sent John Henry Winder to here. John Henry Winder later became a famous Confederate general. Most of the men that came up here were from the South. So all those men that were here a generation later, they became Civil War generals. They were our enemy instead of our friends. Unusual. So John Henry Winder became the commandant of every single prisoner of war camp in the Confederacy. And if he would have lived the Civil War, he would have been hung quickly. They hated him. Ironically, his oldest son, who was an aide-de-camp for his father here in Fort Kent, the oldest son was William Winder. He became our first official postmaster. So he got the actual commission from the postmaster department. They always, all those appointments then were political. So he must have been of the right party. He got elected to be postmaster for Fort Kent, the first official one. He, in turn, disagreed with his father when the Civil War happened. He remained Union, very Union. They made him a general. Now, Fort Kent, we all know, has a connection to Alcatraz. Does everybody remember why we have a connection to Alcatraz? Well, John Stoddy and the money and all that. Yeah, we've all heard those stories 100 times. Well, William Winder, later, during the Civil War, moved to San Francisco. And he became the commandant of a prisoner of war camp that they called... Anyway, to make a long story short, he built the prison at Alcatraz. So we have two connections to Alcatraz. And if I'm a good boy for the rest of my life, we won't have three. So, but we had, that was that connection. Ironically, Abraham Lincoln knew him personally and disliked him personally. The reason being is after the island was complete, they had a prisoner of war camp on Alcatraz Island. William Winder wanted a promotion, of course, so he brought photographers in to photograph everything in 1863. Problem was, the photographers he invited were Confederate sympathizers that sold their negatives to the Confederacy. So it didn't become a prisoner of war camp until slightly later, where it was a military prison. And then in the 1930s, our good friend John Stoddy and Al Capone and all that moved there. And the Rock was only open officially as a prison for 30 years. So very short time, very, very short time. And the reason being the salt just completely deteriorates that building. And that's what they're running against now is it's falling apart. Because it's right in the middle of the bay. And so it's pretty bad. So, okay, where were we at? Okay, we have the treaty, August 9th, 1842. The treaty happened in Washington. There's a lot of local myths that the treaty, or some of the people from the treaty came up here and that they got them drunk and they went up the St. Francis River instead of continuing up the St. John, which was the plan. We don't know why they went up the St. Francis River. We have no clue. Although it gave the state of Maine 1 million extra acres. So in actuality, we got a heck of a lot more than we should have in that treaty. Because they've since proven that Benjamin Franklin met the highlands of the St. Lawrence was Mars Hill. They knew it. And Daniel Webster actually used it for leverage with the Congress because the Congress was saying, no, we want it all. We want the state of Maine to go all the way to the St. Lawrence. So that's what happened. Negotiation, a good thing, like, wish we could see some more of that today. So they negotiate. So the gentleman that did it was Daniel Webster. He was Secretary of State under Martin Van Buren, and then he became Secretary of State under William Henry Harrison, who was our shortest president. He was only there a month. They think he died because of his inaugural address, not writing it, but saying it. And then consequently, John Tyler became the first president. It's the first person to become president after a president had died. Unprecedented. They weren't sure if he was a president or acting as a president, but he dug his heels in and said, no, I'm the president. I took an oath, I'm the president. So Daniel Webster stayed with the cabinet, where the rest of the cabinet that belonged to William Henry Harrison left him high and dry, actually. So with Daniel Webster, he met his British counterpart. They weren't called ambassadors then, they were called plenary ministers. And he came over, he was very familiar with the state of Maine. The gentleman, Lord Alexander Baring Ashburton. His title was Lord Ashburton, so his actual last name was Baring, which the Baring Bank, Baring Brothers Bank, just went bankrupt probably 12 years ago, I think, in London. They were still around. They were a huge financing. They financed actually the War of 1812 on both sides. They made good big. No, they bet both of them. So anyway, and Alexander Baring was married to a young lady from Philadelphia. Her name was Anne Bingham. And those Binghams owned large swaths of the state of Maine. Millions of acres, actually, bigger than the northern Maine woods of today. It's probably about 6 million acres. So, although they didn't think of it at the time, he definitely had a conflict of interest there. He should not have decided that, but like I said, it was founded mostly in our favor. We got the most land out of it, and then we got the reciprocal treaties where the St. John River became navigable to each of us. So we didn't necessarily have to ask Canada to go downriver. We could. So, and that's what some of the things the treaty did. Actually, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, only a small part of the actual treaty was about the border. There was dozens of things that they were settling. There was slavery. There was they were talking about a boat that the United States had entered and had arrested a British citizen. So there was a variety of things that they were studying. And like I said, they stayed all summer in Washington. They had a blast. One in the Ashburton party drank himself to death. So it must have been great. And they signed it. The building's still there. It's right across the street from the White House, almost next door to Blair House, which was the presidential guest house of today. So right there. So it's amazing that Fort Kent was in the mouth of people like President John Tyler and Queen Victoria. They knew exactly what was going on in this area. So we were literally, taking a word from 9/11, we were literally ground zero. Okay, so after the treaty, the surveyors come. So the surveyors, they're the ones who decided on who got what. And like I said, the richest Acadian was a grandson of the first patriarch. And he owned the most property of any Acadian ever. He had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. And improved acres too on top of that. But he also had 9 boys. He had 9 boys and he had 9 girls. So this lot, the 433 acre lot, got split up among his 4 boys. The oldest got the best piece, Jambetzis. And that's all the swath up to the bottom, or to where the Doobie House is now. We finally, through research, have figured out why they moved the Doobie House. We always assumed wrongly that it was because of flooding, but doing research, I found that Fort Kent didn't flood until 1923. And it wasn't just because they had cut the base in the woods. It wasn't just that. Our ancestors turned the St. John River into a giant sluice. So as soon as that water is ready to go down, it's not before, like before the St. John River had ponds and it had eddies and it had, curves, and I mean, they literally dynamited the river to become a giant sluice. That's all it is. So that's why we flood today. And I debate with a lot of people. I probably going to get a brick through my picture window any day, but I always thought that the Dickey-Lincoln Dam would have been beneficial to us because we could have controlled that river. And we wouldn't need a dike, and we wouldn't need this protection if only we would control the river. So I know, St. Francis would have been covered by water, but not always, but I think it would have been very beneficial to us. It would have controlled everything. We wouldn't have had to move or do anything. It would have been controlled. The Chinese are now doing that. That's how they control their rivers. So, 1843, Fort Kent doesn't change a heck of a lot after the surveyors come. So they come in the 1840s, and we see through some of the census records and agricultural census records, we know exactly what these people are eating, what they're living in, how many sheep they have, how many cows they have. And because we were part of contested territory, there's double records. So we have records that the Americans did and records that the British did. So that's very unusual and very lucky, I guess, because we have the comparison of both. So Fort Kent in the 1850s, we had gone from, our first name of our area was the Fish River, Maine. And then when the Maine militia came, does anybody know what they called the blockhouse? It wasn't Fort Kent. It was Fort Jarvis. So from 1839 to 1841, it was known as Fort Jarvis. And then the U.S. Army came, Lucian Webster, and he personally was the one who decided that it was going to be Fort Kent. So he decided, and he named it after the governor, Edward Kent. The fort, not the town. Let me rephrase that. It was the fort was called Fort Kent, not the actual town. So we went Fort Kent. So by 1850, our area is now known as Hancock Plantation. And Hancock Plantation encompassed a little bit of St. John, a little bit of Wallagrass, a little bit of New Canada, probably a little bit of Frenchville. We're not 100% sure what the outline was because we had issues with it. The election of 1858 was quite a funny election. 1857, the famous William Dickey. Has anybody heard of William Dickey? He was the one who founded the university. He was John Martin of his day. He was in the legislature forever and a day. And he's the one, like I mentioned before, he shot through the Incorporation in 1869 because he was in the legislature at the time. So the election of 1857, he cheated a little bit and got found out. So consequently, instead of William Dickey going to the legislature in 1857, Peter Charles Keegan went from Van Buren because he actually won the election. But they went down to Augusta and they fought it out and recounts and no ballot tampering at the time. I think that comes later in our history. But he had won. So William Dickey went home in a huff. He had only stayed there 100 days. So he left mad. So he thought, I'm going to do one better on them. I'm going to become the sole state senator from Aroostook County. So that's what he did. But he also ordered quite a few barrels of whiskey in order to do that. And he also went, because he was a first selectman here in Fort Kent, he also went to the town clerk's home. The town clerk's name was William Henry Cunliffe, and he stole the voter rolls. So, because of what happened that day, and of course Major Dickey won by a landslide. I mean, Richard Nixon would have been so proud. I mean, it was one of those, a great election. He won by 1,200 votes or something crazy like that, which there wasn't even, I believe, 1,200 votes in the whole election. So he got found out, and they did a report on it in Augusta, and actually it's in Roger Parody's book, if anybody wants to read that report. But a lot of our settlers, and Josie Nadeau is one of them, which I'll talk about him next. Josie Nadeau testified what happened, that there were naked people running down the street. There was gallons of alcohol being consumed. The ballots were colored. So if you voted Democrat, of course you voted blue. If you voted Whig or Republican, it was pink. And David Page, of the famous Page House history and all that, they were going to beat the shit out of him. So he won that election, but consequently, after it was investigated, he lost. Now, I've always been of the opinion, reading things about Major Dickey, that if he'd have been Catholic, he'd be canonized by now. He'd be, because he did so many things. But he was like all of us. He was not perfect. And he did mess up a lot. Because he was kind of sent home from Augusta with his tail between his legs. And then, by the 1860s, they had forgotten all about that. So 1860, the legislature passes a law. Fort Kent is now going to become 2 separate townships. So can anybody guess what they called it? So T18 Range 6 and T18 Range 7. That was the official titles, but they called T18 Range 6 Fort Kent. So all the way up to just above here, just above the Doobie House, was one township, 6 square miles, and that was called Fort Kent. So from, let's say, the cemetery of today to the Frenchville town line, anybody want to guess what the name of it was?
Frenchville?
No. Dagle. It was called Dagle. Dagle. It was called Dagle because they had a lot of Dagles there. Actually, generations of Dagles. That eventually, like Zeno Dagle's land was done by one of his ancestors, who was one of the descendants. The Dagles, there's more Dagles and Pelletiers than dirt. That's how I've always thought of it, because, and so a very prolific family in our area. So it was called Dagle. So by 1868, Major Dickey, those people, they remember 10 years ago what happened. They probably still hung over from that time. They elected him again. And that's when Major Dickey starts that canonization, I guess you want to call that. Oh my God, what a famous person. He's been there forever, and he was in this election of 1857, but they don't mention that he cheated. They always mention it though. The legislature of 1857 was his first, but he didn't stay there. He was, and actually in the 1860s, he may have embezzled a little bit from the school. So there was, not perfection, but so by 1869, when William Dickey submits to the legislature and all the committees a bill to incorporate the town of Fort Kent, they apparently had forgotten what happened 10 years before. So they incorporated T18 Range 6 and T18 Range 7 became Fort Kent. So at February 23rd this year, it was 150 years that we were officially Fort Kent. We never changed after that. But we had a variety of different names until then.